My name is Mubarak, and this is En Masse. So for this episode of En Masse, I'll be interviewing Tyler A. Shipley, who is a professor of society, culture, and commerce in the Department of Liberal Studies at Humber College, Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. He holds a PhD in political science from York University. He's written 2 books so far, his first book being Ottawa and Empire, which was released in 2017, and his latest work being Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and Colonial Imagination. And that will be the focus of this episode of En Masse. So for the first question, I wanted to ask, who is Tyler Shipley and what inspired you to write your book, Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination?
This has been a project that I've been working on for years. Arguably this has been rolling around for the last 10, 15 years for me. And, it's taken this long for me to get to the point where I was capable of, putting it all together. But I've been thinking for a long time about what Canada is in the world. I think that for a long time I've been really sickened by the sanctimonious Canadian, discourse about, the Americans are so awful, but we're much better. When I was in high school, I took Canadian studies classes, and we we talked about what did it mean to be Canadian, and it was all this stuff about being nice or being polite, or the more sophisticated version of that, which is being peacekeepers, being good neighbors, trying to help other countries if possible, being responsible in the world, this kind of really sanctimonious self-certainty about Canada's inherent goodness, just the deep-rooted goodness and good intentions of Canada. And at a certain point that just started to ring false to me. Increasingly over the years, whether it was in Canada's relations with Indigenous peoples or in Canada's behavior in the rest of the world, this just increasingly didn't fit for me. And so my work as a graduate student turned to this kind of accidentally. I was in Central America in 2009 when the government of Honduras was overthrown, the president was overthrown, and I immediately went there and I joined the protests, and I kind of was part of that movement and documented human rights abuses and so on. And in that process, it really concretized what I already knew, which is that Canada was playing a central role in undermining democracy, undermining human rights, undermining all the values that Canada claimed to stand for. And I was right there in Honduras documenting it. And so that became, my first book, which was a specific study of Canada's role in supporting the overthrow of, the democratic government in Honduras. And that book always had in the background this sense of, this is not a unique case. This is one tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. And so that's, I think, where this book comes from. This book comes from that sense that Canada is not what it claims to be, or what certain sections of Canadian society claim for it. And we just really needed to have a comprehensive account of what Canada actually is, what Canada actually does in the world, because I don't think that exists. And so, I wanted to create that.
So to kind of riff off of what you were already saying, if you were to describe what Canada presents itself as, how would you explain it? And how does your book address this?
Yeah, so there's a course that I teach, which is also called Canada in the World, and I developed that course while I was working on the book. They kind of came together. And the first thing I do, or one of the first things I do in that class, is I ask my students to, talk about what Canada means to them. And my students are an interesting mix. There's lots of international students. lots of domestic students, but many of them are not white. Many of them are first or second generation immigrants. So it's quite a mix of people in terms of their relationship to Canada and Canadianness. And yet I still get often the same things that you would expect. Canada is nice, it's polite, people say sorry, all the superficial sort of silly things, right? Which I think, serve a purpose. I think all that superficial stuff serves the purpose of it creates the idea, the impression that there's nothing else to say about Canada. Canada's so sweet and quaint and good that there is no big discussion to be had about what Canada is. Therefore, we can just make jokes about igloos and maple syrup and snow and all of this kind of thing. I think that sort of superficial layer hides or obscures the deeper dynamic here, which is that Canadians believe, and many people around the world believe, that Canada is a good guy, that Canada is in the world trying to help, well-intentioned. And I come back to this a lot in the book. The idea that Canada is well-intentioned, that it probably makes mistakes, sure, everyone makes mistakes, but that Canada is always trying to do the right thing, trying to obviously take care of itself and look out for its own interests, but also, balance that with a reasonable appreciation of the needs of others. And how can we all get through this? And there's a conflict somewhere. How can we all just step back and figure this out in a way that's beneficial to everyone? Surely we can do that. Which sounds cool. And theoretically, I'd be down for that, right? But in practice, that's not what Canada does in terms of its actions. But more importantly, that's not what motivates Canada. Canada's actions are not motivated by a kind of a sincere desire to help everyone get along. That's just not empirically. That's not valid, and it can't really be defended. A serious accounting of Canada's record makes that narrative fall apart. So, I think that story that Canada tells about itself is designed to obviously delude ourselves. I think it comes from above. I think it's a story that's told from above, but then gets repeated sort of at the level of the average Canadian. And even, as I say, even people outside of Canada, the story just gets repeated over and over and over again until we just assume it to be true. And then we don't want to look for it to be untrue. Once we've accepted it, there's something satisfying. And I remember this, growing up. I remember there being something satisfying about the idea that, the Americans were out there behaving like a dick, but Canada would never do that. We're better than that. And there's something satisfying. And I think the longer you spend in that and the more committed you become to it, the harder it is when someone like me comes along and says, I'm really sorry, but this is complete bullshit. We become really emotionally connected to that ideology. So this book's gonna hurt some people, but maybe it's a necessary evil.
Yeah, I've definitely found that when talking to people in Canada about the US, for example, and its policies, it's a lot easier to have those conversations. But the second I mentioned that, Trudeau has done XYZ or has done, similar things, or Canada has done or is doing similar things that aren't that different, or that it even supports these things that the US is doing, I find that those conversations are a lot harder to have, and people think it's some sort of conspiracy theory or something crazy.
Well, and also, even within the left, there's a serious reluctance in the Canadian left to do critical work about Canada in terms of its international role. And I think it's that exact thing. If you look at studies of Canadian foreign policy, or even just studies of Canada in general, and the sort of orientation of the Canadian left, so much of it is deeply committed to the idea that the United States is bad. The United States is an empire. The United States, is doing all this harm, and Canada is forced to go along with it, right? This is a really, really powerful narrative for huge sections of, especially the sort of the NDP, the sort of soft left, those kinds of sections. People who, consider themselves progressive, probably generally, want to support the welfare state and, want to try to be anti-racist. People who are loosely associated with the left, but not necessarily those that are on the far left and committed to really revolutionary politics. But that section, they desperately want Canada to be redeemable. And when confronted with the fact that Canada does harmful things in the world, which, if you're a responsible, serious person at all, you have to grapple with the fact that Canada does harm in the world. But for those sections of the kind of the nationalist left, they basically write that off as, yeah, Canada did some bad things, but Canada had to because the Americans told them, because Canada had to do the war in Afghanistan because Bush, told us that we had to. And, what would happen to Canada if we lost our relationship with the Americans? What if they shut down the border? What if they wouldn't buy our lumber? What could we do? We're stuck, and this is a really powerful story for even for the left. And what I wanted to do with this book, in part, was to say, man, that ain't it. Like, it's certainly true that Canada's fate is tied to the United States. It's certainly true that there's a very, very intense relationship, that there's a lot of overlap, that there's all kinds of ways in which Canada's wrapped up in the project of U.S. empire, yes. But by choice. By choice. The Canadian ruling class chose its path. The Canadian ruling class, has lined itself up with the U.S. empire precisely because the U.S. empire inherited the role of the British Empire. And the Canadian ruling class has always been essentially part of that broader Anglo-imperial project. So this book will also be hard for those people, those on the left who wish to believe that there's some goodness in Canada that can be saved if we just weren't being bullied by the Americans.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting how the quote-unquote progressives in Canada have this tendency to, every time the government or the state does something that they don't like, they consider it to be un-Canadian. So they see everything from this kind of like nationalistic perspective where it's like, oh, this is happening in Canada. How could this happen in Canada? Even though this has been kind of the history of Canada from day one.
It's like stealing, that's not Canadian. I'm sorry, Canada is based on theft. There would be no Canada without theft. Violence. Violence is so un-Canadian. Come on, there's no Canada without violence. Yeah, I think that's a big part of what I'm trying to do in this book, is to say Canada's founded upon the very same things that, a liberal Canadian in 2020, would be upset about in Donald Trump. The very same things that liberal Canadians look at and say, oh God, things in the States are so awful, aren't they? The exact same logic is at the heart of Canada. It's at the foundation of Canada, and it's what Canada has been doing and is doing for more than 150 years. But it's a tough pill to swallow. Canadians are really committed to their mythology, and it's repeated and even in ways that are very subtle. It's like beer commercials, that kind of do these flyovers of the mountains and the lakes and the fields, and the whole thing about Canada, this vast territory, this vast empty land, and nature, this whole sort of nature thing that Canada is associated with, and for some reason beer commercials really lean into the kind of the natural wilderness of Canada. And it's like it's part of this old narrative that Canada was this vast, empty, natural environment, and, settlers came and turned it into a country when it had been this empty. It's like, sorry, there were hundreds of nations of people that lived on this land. It was never empty. It was actively emptied by Canada.
And this transitions perfectly into the next question, because in your book, you've described the existence of Canada as a colonial project that was driven by one fundamental material goal: the destruction of Indigenous political economic practices and their displacement by capitalism. When we look at this historically and presently, what does this look like? And how do you concretely explain the relationship between Canadian settler colonialism and capitalism then and now?
So, I look at the initial colonial project here, and of course it's similar to the projects in the United States, in Australia, in other settler colonies. And it's of course a massively complicated historical, phenomena, but I think it's fair, certainly in the Canadian case, to kind of boil it down to two essential components. And, the subheading of the book or the subtitle of the book is Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination, because I argue that colonialism, settler colonialism in Canada, its fundamental material goal was to gain control of the land in order to establish a new space for capitalist accumulation. That necessarily entailed getting rid of Indigenous people. Because for capitalism to function, it had to control the land. It had to turn the land into private property in order to make, to sort of get the engine running for the exploitation of that land, and of course the exploitation of labor on that land. This is completely incommensurate with Indigenous modes of production, or modes of living, as Glenshon Coulter calls it. The ways in which people related to not just the land, but the cosmos, each other, families, morals, ethics, everything. And so it was not possible for capitalism to coexist alongside, Indigenous social life, social structures. And so Canada had to, in order to fulfill its project, its material goal of creating capitalism here, Canada had to eliminate the Indigenous people by whatever means, whether that meant, murder, which it often did, whether that meant imprisonment, and dispersal onto reserves, which of course it often did, whether that meant the destruction of Indigenous culture inside of, Indigenous people. And so, of course, the residential schools is the obvious example of that. And Canadian officials are very explicit about this. When they say the schools are designed to kill the Indian in the child, they're very explicit about the fact that what they're doing is destroying what it means to be Indigenous. So their idea is that several generations later, you might have people who, at some biological level are a descendant from, Indigenous people, but they won't be Indigenous because culturally they will have been assimilated into, well, actually, that's almost a direct quote. One of the officials around the time of Confederation says that we want there to be no Indian question. We want them all to be assimilated such that there is no Indian and there is no Indian question. That's almost a direct quote. So this kind of violent project of the destruction of Indigenous people requires some kind of mental apparatus for how to justify it, right? Because this is going to be foundational for all of the settlers. The destruction of Indigenous people, that's dark. And some of the people coming over to Canada, some of the settlers, may not be already intrinsically programmed for genocide. Many of them are poor people coming over from England, working class people trying to escape the conditions of industrial revolution England. how are you going to get them to get on board for genocide? You need some kind of mental apparatus to make it acceptable. And so that's the colonial imagination, the idea of white supremacy, the ideological framework that says, look, people are divided into different races, and those races, some are better than others, some are smarter than others, some are more advanced, and white people are at the top. They are the most advanced. Their society is the most advanced. Their technology is the most advanced. Their morals, their cultural beliefs, their religion is all at the top. And everyone else is on this hierarchy somewhere down the line. Therefore, when we, the white settlers, come to Canada, yes, we do have to eliminate the Indigenous people because we have to move society forward. We have to progress. And the only way to progress is to get these people to be more white. Either they become more white or, we don't have room for them in this society that we're building on top of, their land. So those are the twin pillars, right? It's this material goal, settler capitalism, the construction of a capitalist society and capitalist economy in this place, which necessarily requires taking the land and eliminating Indigenous people. And then the colonial imagination, the kind of ideological apparatus of white supremacy that sustains it, that justifies it. And those two things, those two dynamics that are at the heart of the construction of Canada remain present throughout every piece of Canada's history. And in particular, when you look at all of the rest of Canada's foreign engagements. Canada's first engagement with any foreign nation is, of course, its relations with Indigenous peoples, right? These are foreign nations. Canada, the settlers, the British, they all understood that they were dealing with foreign nations. So it's a case of foreign policy. And from that case of foreign policy, every other foreign policy fits into the same logic. And in the book, I trace, the entirety of Canadian history, the whole thing. And I find in every case those dynamics, the dynamic of creating, protecting, maintaining the conditions for capitalism and for capital accumulation for the rich, and the ideology of white supremacy and colonialism. Those two things, they're just always there.
Although Canada was initially led and directed by British imperialism, at what point did capitalism begin to have its own autonomy? And what did this development of Canadian settler capitalism look like as it became a bit more detached from Great Britain?
Yeah, I mean, there is a tendency, I think, in Canada to disavow itself of anything that happened before Confederation, which I think is, ludicrous. But I see it on Twitter. You try to talk about any element of the genocide that happened before Confederation, and somehow that's the British did that, and it wasn't us. I mean, it's just such arbitrary nonsense. I think one element of Canada's story that is somewhat unique. I mean, there's other cases that fit it a bit, but certainly distinguishes it from the United States, is the very gradual process by which the Canadian ruling class, extricates itself from the British ruling class. It's a story that this gradual separation of the Canadian elite from the British elite is a story that is documented in enormous detail in most books about Canadian history and Canadian foreign policy. White Canadian historians love to retell the tale of how Canada gradually, peacefully took each little piece of autonomy and coerced and cajoled the British into allowing it to, have its own militia, and then allowing it to, issue its own foreign policy statements, all the little tiny pieces of this gradual separation, from the empires, from the mother country. And in many ways, I don't give a shit about that, because what I see is continuity. I see continuity all the way through this. I see continuity from, pre-Confederation leadership of the Canadian colonies. The decision to confederate itself is not anti-British in any way. It's Actually, it's motivated more than anything by the idea that ruling classes of Ontario and Quebec wanted to make sure that they could maintain their autonomy from the United States, as a separate entity. And the only way they felt they could do that was if they conquered the rest of what becomes Canada, connecting British Columbia to Ontario and Quebec. And Confederation is motivated primarily by the pressing, urgent need that they felt to clear the plains of Indigenous people and claim that land for Canada, for what becomes Canada, before the Americans did it. So there's an inter-imperial rivalry that's taking place there between these different factions of the Anglo, ruling classes. But at no point does Canada have, does the Canadian elite have any kind of antipathy for Britain, for Great Britain and for the British Empire project. As a matter of fact, Canada and the Canadian elite are some of the biggest cheerleaders of British imperialism. Obviously before Confederation, but after it as well. And, the connection, the deep-rooted connection of the Canadian ruling class to Britain really is the central story of Canada up to the Second World War, and I would say even into, the Cold War era. As far as, we get to the 1950s and 60s, and some of the parts of the book that even I was surprised by as I was working through it, the extent to which in the 50s and 60s, Canada defends imperialism, colonialism, the direct conquest of parts of Asia, Africa, Oceania, and other parts of the world by European powers. Canada actively defends the British Empire in particular, but, all of the colonial empires. Canada calls it a tragedy when Vietnamese people defeat France at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and gain their independence. The Canadian Prime Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, stands up in Parliament and laments the tragic end of the conflict between France and Vietnam. Canada actively says that India and Pakistan are not ready for independence, and that Britain should continue to tutor them in how to be more civilized as they move towards independence. Canada actively cautions Britain at moving too quickly in allowing its colonies their independence in Africa. Every step of the way, Canada is an imperial cheerleader. I've even got there's a quote I'm gonna give you because it's so ludicrous and funny. This is from Lester B. Pearson, right? Famed Canadian. Gosh, we all just, fall on our knees to the memory of Lester B. Pearson, right? Great peacekeeper. Yeah, right? Yeah. So this is 1957. Lester B. Pearson says, and bear with me, the quote is a real tongue twister, but bear with me here. Those countries which still have direct responsibilities for non-self-governing territories should not be made to feel at the United Nations or elsewhere that they are oppressors, to be deprived arbitrarily of their rights or indeed their reputations. I'm going to take it back. I'll take it back. Let's just catch who he's talking about. Those countries which still have direct responsibilities for non-self-governing territories. I mean, he's talking about colonizers. Non-self-governing territories? Am I allowed to, is this podcast, can I use the F word on this podcast? Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out of here. Non-self-governing territories? Countries that have direct responsibility for non-self-governing territories? That's a fucking quite a way to describe a colonial power that has imposed itself, on the Congo or Ghana or Algeria, or any of the other countries that Pearson is referring to. So, I know I answered your question in a kind of a weird roundabout way, but in terms of Canada's relationship to empire, Canada is empire. Canada always was empire. The British Empire, Canada is a project of the British Empire that then, sort of takes over control. It's like a department that just sort of grows into its own, it doesn't really need to sort of, do things separately. It can kind of function on its own. Canada continues to be an imperial cheerleader all the way through. And then, of course, the shift, in the middle of the 20th century is from the British Empire to the American Empire. And Canada becomes, a cheerleader in effectively the same way for the American Empire, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but
Yeah, interestingly enough, I've come across certain, fascist groups that I've looked into and have learned that, there's one group in particular called the Red Ensign. And essentially what they do is argue against the current Canadian flag because they actually prefer the one that had the British like emblem kind of like part of it, which was like, I think it was basically different flags that were kind of contending for which one would be the official flag of Canada. And that's one of the ones that was more blatantly in support of British imperialism. And so there's all these groups that basically like look at that and kind of worship this like imperial nature of Canada's history, and they laud it and they love it. So clearly fascism in Canada appears to be alive and well. So how do we understand fascism's existence here in relation to the broader discussion around settler capitalism presently and historically?
Yeah, I mean, I dealt with the sort of the fascist question a lot in the book because fascism is far more present in the history of the 20th century and 21st century than most people realize. Firstly, most people think of fascism, it's like, well, it's Hitler. Maybe they extend that to include Mussolini and perhaps Japan, but really it's fascism for most people is contained within that moment, and of course that's not correct. There's been plenty of fascism, and Canada's record on fascism is extremely consistent. The only moment at which it briefly breaks from fascism is World War II. And I mean, the declaration of World War II, because right up to the declaration of war, Canada's still very much on side with fascism. So I spend a lot of time on this, and I think there's a few ways to look at it. I think you can say that in the first place, a country that's founded on genocide, is going to be a place that's ripe for fascism. It's no coincidence that Hitler himself admired Canada and admired Canadian policy towards Indigenous people. There's a quote, and I don't remember if it's in Mein Kampf or where it is, but there is a fairly famous quote by Hitler where he says, "When we eat wheat from Canada, we do not think of the despoiled Indians." And what he means, of course, is that Canada's genocide was so effective that we eat Canadian wheat grown on the very ground where Indigenous people were killed and starved and cleared out, and we don't think twice about it. And of course, he is saying this in the context of his plans for Jews and his other opponents, certainly the left and other opponents, where he's saying, look, if we do this right, no one will even remember. We will literally erase them from history, just like Canada. So, I mean, if that's your starting point, if your starting point as a nation is that you are, an emblem for what the most famous, fascist in the world, aspires to be, then that's a pretty inauspicious start. And and it really does flow from there. The conquest of the West, the creation of Canada, so what we celebrate on Canada Day, Confederation, was premised on the march of thousands of soldiers, British and Canadian soldiers, to what is now, the area around Winnipeg, to commit a massacre of Métis resistors, mostly Métis, but also some Indigenous resistors, who were not interested in being part of this Canadian project. So it's a horrific, repressive project. The actual clearing of the plains, the actual process by which Canada gains that territory. And to say nothing of all of the stuff that happens before that, which is also terrible, but, in the interest of time, focus on, that moment in, the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Canada foments a starvation crisis. Canada very, very consciously and intentionally puts Indigenous people in a position where they will starve, where knowingly they will starve, where they will have no choice but to submit their land, submit to the Canadian state, sign the treaties, and and in many cases they die anyways, because even after Canada signs treaties, treaties which say, look, if you agree to move to a certain place, and cede all of this territory to us and live on this reserve, we, Canada, will provide you with food, and implements to do agriculture in this place, in this piece of land. And then Canada doesn't even fulfill that part of its bargain, and so many Indigenous people die. So if that's your starting point, it's not much of a leap that by the 1930s, you've got a prime minister who supports fascism actively. You have decades of racial violence in Canada, between Confederation and, the sort of the industrialization of Canada, the kind of early industrial era, anything from the hyper-exploitation of Chinese workers on the railroad, anti-Japanese riots in Vancouver, where white people in 1907, burn down a Japanese neighborhood, just a whole range of sort of racist, vigilante kind of violence in Canada in that time. And then, of course, the 1930s, when fascism, really emerges as an ideology and gains in strength. There are fascists here. There's fascists here in Toronto, where I am. There were fascists who attacked a Jewish baseball team over at Christie Pitts Park. Happy ending to that story, of course, is that they got their ass kicked. The Jewish and Italian people that lived in that neighborhood, really took the baseball bats and really beat down that group of Nazis, the Swastika Club that showed up there, and did so without the support of the police, of course, because the chief of police in Toronto himself was, just a virulent anti-Semitic, racist, borderline fascist, and knew that the Swastika Clubs were going to go and attack this Jewish baseball team, and made sure that his officers would not respond. And, that might sort of be like, oh gosh, that's shocking. But in fact, there were fascist organizations in Winnipeg, in Quebec City, perhaps was actually the largest, under Adrien Arcand, the fascists there, the Chemise Bleue. And then, of course, famously, the Canadian Prime Minister who went to visit Hitler in 1937. And he wasn't just tolerant. There's people who look back on that episode and will say, well, he was a statesman. He was trying his best to maintain peace. He was trying to find a common path to avoid war and all these things. And that's just garbage. I read his diaries. The man was in love. The man was completely overwhelmed by his awe of Hitler. And the passages are really kind of sickening. I won't read you any, there are several of them in the book, but, what stands out for me is that, for one thing, William Lyon Mackenzie King, Prime Minister, was not the least bit bothered by the anti-Semitism. That by that point, we're talking about 1937. Jews are wearing the Star of David. It's already very clear what's happening in Germany, and he's seeing it because he's there. He's in Berlin, but he's nodding along in agreement. And this is in his own diaries. He's recounting, his meeting with Hitler, and he's reporting quite matter-of-factly that Hitler explained to him that the Jews have really ruined Germany. They've taken over everything. They've taken over the movie theaters. What it must be like to be a German and go to a movie theater filled with Jews. And Mackenzie King is reporting all of this, saying that he's very sympathetic and he understands and believes that Hitler is a true patriot and someone who really cares about his country. So, that's the 1930s, right? And of course, at the same time, by the way, lest we forget, Canada is supporting fascist Japan. All of this couched in colonial terms. When Japan attacks China, when fascist Japan, Imperial Japan, attacks mainland China in 1937, vicious, horrific attack, the massacre at Nanjing in particular. And Canada describes this quite, calmly as Japan is simply trying to put her neighbor countries into a better state. That's almost the direct quote. I have the direct quote in there, but it's something along those lines. Japan is just trying to improve the conditions of these other places. So, Canada's a long history of supporting fascism.
So what would you say are some of the ways in which the Canadian state supports fascism in the present day?
Yeah, it carries right through. From the support for fascist dictatorships in Latin America throughout the 20th century, And in the present, of course, right? In the case of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who comes to power very explicitly, in a fascist way, and with fascist sort of narratives about ruling with the Bible and the bullet. And of course, Canada, has embraced Bolsonaro in many ways, and Canada has worked very closely with Jair Bolsonaro in attempting to overthrow the government of Venezuela. That's where Chrystia Freeland and Bolsonaro have really, had a meeting of the minds, cooperating in trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. And of course, the mention of Chrystia Freeland opens us up to, I think, probably the most prominent way in which Canada is supporting fascism right now, which is in Ukraine. The government of Ukraine, since the Euromaidan protests, has been effectively a fascist government that has its roots in the fascists from the Second World War, the very same organizations from that time. And Canada is a strong and overt, really a sort of aggressive supporter of Ukraine. Now, of course, this is always framed as Canada's protecting Ukraine from Russia, right, from Putin. And that's always the way it's framed. What's interesting about this, setting aside the question of Putin and the sort of kleptocratic capitalist dictatorship in Russia, which I have no sympathy for. But setting aside that, the way that Canada frames all of this as protecting Ukraine from Russia is fascinating because it taps into a narrative that actually goes back to the Second World War. Ukrainian fascists in the Second World War claimed that the Soviet Union was the aggressor and that Nazi Germany had come to Ukraine to save them from the aggressive Soviet Union. And so, here's where the story gets interesting for Canadians. So Chrystia Freeland's grandfather, Michael Chomiak, is one of the highest-ranking Nazi propagandists in Ukraine, and the only person who is higher than him is Volodymyr Kubijovich, who is the highest-ranking Ukrainian Nazi during the Second World War, collaborators with the Nazis. Chrystia Freeland's grandfather, Michael Chomiak, was so important, considered such a valuable asset to the Nazis, that when the Nazis retreated from Ukraine, they brought him. They brought Chomiak with them. Chomiak had been set up as this really high-ranking, he ran a newspaper in Krakow, and was this very high-ranking member of the apparatus of the Nazi occupation. Flash forward to the present. Chomiak ends up in Canada, of course, and his family is here. And now we've got Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister. And then, in 2017, I think it was, some Russian news agency that said, Canadians might be interested to know that her grandfather was a fascist. Now, she denies it, right? She says that's not true, it's Russian propaganda. But it quickly becomes clear that it is true. So then she says, no, well, fine, maybe it's true, but I didn't know. Well, okay, that turns out to be a lie too, because Chrystia Freeland, actually, her career, her journalistic, career, is actually based on the same politics that her grandfather espoused. In fact, she worked with him. Chrystia Freeland is an author, a co-author. She's part of the project to write a history of Ukraine, now an extremely right-wing nationalist history of Ukraine. The two people behind that book were Michael Chomiak and his old Nazi boss, Volodymyr Kubijovich. So Chrystia Freeland has a long-standing and not incidental connection to this lineage of Ukrainian Nazism, Ukrainian fascism. So is it any surprise that Canada emerges as the strongest, most outspoken supporter of the Ukrainian fascists? I mean, it's not a surprise to me. So, these are just a couple of cases, right? But, I think you can zoom out from it too and say, why is this? What is the root of this? Why would Canada support fascism? And the reason, of course, is that fascism is an ideology that protects capitalism. Fascism emerges when capitalism is under threat. Whenever capitalism is faced with revolutionary politics and mass movements of people that are prepared to undermine, and possibly overthrow this system of production and this ruling class, fascism is the mask coming off. When the liberals cannot co-opt, and squirm their way through, governing a capitalist world, they turn to the fascists to do it for them. That's obviously a simplified version, but that's the emergence of Mussolini in Italy. That's the emergence of Hitler in Germany. That's how these things come about. And so fascism is extremely useful to the liberal ruling classes when faced with any kind of revolutionary upsurge. And that's why Canada has always been very supportive of fascism when it's been necessary to maintain the capitalist world order. So I don't know if that helps sort of connect some of those dots. I hope it does.
Yeah, and I heard that recently a Ukrainian fascist tombstone somewhere in Canada was defaced, and initially the government was actually investigating it as a hate crime.
Yeah, isn't this funny? This is just the other day, and there's a couple of these monuments to the Ukrainian fascists, because Canada actually brought thousands of Ukrainian fascists over to Canada just to have them settle in Canada after the Second World War. Thousands of members of the SS, the Galicia division. And so, yeah, some of these Ukrainian fascists end up settling in Canada, and then, of course, they build monuments and, imagine themselves as these great heroes and saviors of Ukraine. They saved Ukraine, or they tried to save Ukraine from the evil Soviet Union. That narrative is carried forth today as Ukraine saving itself from the evil, Russian Empire. And people go along with this uncritically, because it sort of fits the story. Oh, Canada's supporting, these plucky Ukrainians who are trying to protect themselves from aggression. Without being aware that actually, this is not a plucky, Ukrainian movement defending itself. These are fascists. I'm all for Ukrainian sovereignty. Don't misunderstand. This is not. I'm not suggesting that Ukraine should just be a satellite of Russia, but the movement that is at the head of the sort of the Ukrainian nationalist movement is a fascist movement. There's just no way around it. Yeah, and at the end of the day, I'm an internationalist anyway, so I don't really necessarily support any sovereignty over anything, but that's a totally different question.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Canadian narrative around World War II and stuff is that, they were basically against the fascists from the beginning, when that seems to not be true when you actually look at the historical record. And they tend to amplify even their role in World War II as well, because as we all know, the Soviet Union lost more people and more resources to that war than did any other capitalist country during that time.
Yeah. I mean, it's the mythology of World War II is so deep in Canada, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons, of course, is that it's a simple narrative. Hitler's obviously a bad guy, and no one, including myself, is going to change that. So it does appear, and it's not just that it appears. Canada is on the right side of the Second World War. The fight against fascism is the right side, and so that makes it a really easy war to sell and to mythologize and memorialize. But as you say, I mean, there's an irony to this, because Canada did not want to have to be in a war against Nazi Germany. When Mackenzie King goes to visit Hitler, and maybe I should have said this earlier, it's very explicit, it's very clear in his conversations with, in particular, with the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, before the meeting with Hitler. They strategize, and it's very clear that what the Canadian Prime Minister wants to do is convince Hitler to keep his focus on Eastern Europe, to not threaten British imperial interests. Effectively, King is going there to try to say to Hitler, dude, we're on board. Do your thing. We hate the Jews too. What you're doing is for the benefit of all of Europe. We're not going to interfere. But please understand that if you mess with the British Empire, we will have to interfere. I mean, he's almost apologetic. King desperately does not want to have a war with Hitler. But, to your point, it's understood by, I think, the more far-sighted sections of the Western ruling class that at some point Hitler is going to have to confront the British Empire. I mean, this is the irony of capitalism. All of these capitalist and fascist powers, they're on the same side ideologically. They all get along. That's why King and Hitler get along so well. But at the same time, there are limited profits, right? Lenin does such a good job, in laying all this out in Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism. I mean, ultimately, there is going to be inter-imperial rivalry, because there is a limit to the number of, or to the extent of profits that can be sucked out of this system, sucked out of the working classes of the world. And for the German Empire to expand would have been at the expense of the British Empire, and they were not prepared to accept that. So yeah, I mean, I think at some level, if Hitler had focused his attention entirely on the Soviet Union, there's a very real chance that the West would have supported him in that. But as it becomes clear that Hitler's ambition is bigger than that, they have to go to war, almost apologetically. And by the way, the same is true of Japan. When Canada is forced to go to war against Japan, there's a kind of apologetic nature to it. Bizarre stories about the ways that Canadian diplomats were treated in captivity in Japan, and Japanese officials were treated in captivity in Canada when the war begins. They were all so friendly and pleasant with one another that when the war starts, these officials continue to kind of live comfortably in one another, as prisoners in one another's country. They play golf, they watch movies, they have, meanwhile their soldiers are fighting a war at one another, right? So there's a strange kind of apologetic nature to the outbreak of the Second World War, because ideologically these powers essentially shared the same perspective. They shared, and of course this is a bit more complicated in the Japanese case, but essentially they share the ideology of white supremacy. They share the ideology of capitalism. They're just fighting over who's going to be at the center of it. So yeah, I mean, it is very ironic, right? I mean, Canada parades itself as this sort of anti-fascist, heroes of the anti-fascist crusade, and there is some truth in it. And there are certainly working class Canadians who fought fascism, both, in the fight against Nazi Germany and Japan, but also earlier in the fight against Spain, against, Franco in Spain. There were Canadians who were anti-fascists, and I don't want them to get lost in this. They were on the right side for the right reasons. Canada was on the right side for the wrong reasons. And I think that's an important distinction.
So in regards class struggle in Canada, what would you say were some events or moments that defined the relationship between the proletariat and the capitalist class here? This question, will probably end up extending into a question of the relationship between labor or the proletariat and Indigenous self-determination as well.
That the relationship between, the standard relationship between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, working class and capitalist class, is definitely complicated in Canada because much of the working class was recruited to be part of the settler Colonial Project. They are the settlers. And so, in a certain sense, they share some of the ideological perspective of the ruling class. They are part of the Conquest. My own family, different strands, and I put this into the book, different strands of my family that sort of come from different places at different times. But one strand of my family are, among the first English settlers to take up homesteads in Manitoba on land that had literally just been stolen from Indigenous people. Flash forward to 100 years, and the Shipleys are a rural, poor, working class family. My dad was one of 10 kids. They lived in various parts of rural Manitoba. Their dad moved from place to place trying to find work where he could get it here and there. They did not have much. And so, they're very much, of the working class. And yet, their class position is complicated because their family were beneficiaries of the conquest, of the genocide. So parsing that out is complicated. But, what I try to do in the book is I try to highlight the ways in which the Canadian working class is mixed, right? The way that the Canadian working class is a patchwork of course, the most marginalized groups of people within Canada, which in the first instance is Indigenous people, but then also waves of immigration. Well, I should say Indigenous people and descendants of slaves, Black people in Canada, because of course there were many slaves in Canada, enslaved people, by Canadians, by ruling class Canadians. So there is that aspect of the working class, the Black and Indigenous working class. Then there are the waves of hyper-exploited immigrant communities, people from China and Japan and South Asia, especially in BC, and then waves of immigrants from places like Ukraine, Finland, Poland, many of whom settle in cities like Toronto, but also in Winnipeg. Winnipeg has a really diverse, a lot of Jews, a lot of Jewish immigrants, working class Jews that settle in Winnipeg. And many of them become, members of the early sort of conscious working class, people who are forming trade unions, people who join the Communist Party and become revolutionaries. The Communist Party of Canada plays a pretty significant role in this country's history in the early 20th century. And its most radical members are usually not Anglo settler working class people. It's often immigrants. So it's a complicated story, right? The story of the sort of the class struggle in Canada, because it is inevitably woven or wrapped up in colonialism. And so, yeah, I try in the book to parse all that out, to keep track of, where there are struggles between a Canadian working class and a Canadian ruling class, and when that Canadian working class sides with the ruling elite, when they're bought out, when they're co-opted. Because you get examples of both. During the Spanish Civil War, a lot of, more than 1,000 working class Canadians volunteered to go to Spain and fight fascism, against the wishes of the Canadian government. Many of them, veterans of the work camps and riots against the Canadian state. So, this is a pretty radical section of the working class in Canada. And many of them organized through the Communist Party. But at the same time, that same working class, is fairly susceptible to being brought into, incorporated into racist narratives against obviously Indigenous people in the first place, but a whole range of other, at groups of people at different moments whenever it serves the interests of the ruling class. And, too often they fall in line with that. And they the Canadian working class fails to be internationalist in the way that, certainly I would wish it had been, because the narratives of white supremacy that were at the heart of the Canadian Project were just too powerful. They were just too deep-rooted, and so there was just too much of that, to generate the degree of working class solidarity that, for instance, I would have liked to have seen when Canada sent peacekeepers to the Congo in the 1960s. Congo, elects, after its successful struggle against Belgian colonialism, they elect Patrice Lumumba, socialist brewery worker. He's the first prime minister, and then they're faced with an upsurge of violence from the right. And, the Canadian press, the Canadian working class was not interested in supporting Congolese working people. In the end, it's a Canadian peacekeeper that sells out Patrice Lumumba and gets him killed, leading to the dictatorship of Mobutu. So, yeah, I guess the answer to your question is that it is very complicated to parse out those different dynamics within the Canadian working class. And I think that's a project that's going to be essential in terms of building revolutionary struggles in Canada. It's going to be essential to get to suck that white supremacist ideology out of working class and revolutionary movements and center those movements in the struggle against white supremacy and against capitalism, of course, and against so much of what the Canadian state stands for.
For the next question, I find that although mainstream conversations about racism and colonialism in Canada do somewhat occur, the question of Canadian imperialism or foreign policy in relation to this tends to be less discussed. For example, many people here are unaware of Canada's imperialist role in Haiti or Honduras, which you wrote about. So what is the role Canada plays on the global stage, and why do you think Canadian imperialism is more quote-unquote under the radar? What major players or capitalist enterprises also influence this?
Well, I guess part of the reason Canada flies under the radar is because obviously the United States is just so big and so central to the story of empire in the 21st century, and so Canada does sort of slip under the radar for that reason. And then there's of course this ideological project to make Canada into this nice guy and to build a mythology around Canada's good intentions and its peacekeeping and internationalism, multinationalism. Or multilateralism. That's what they prefer to call it. So I think that's why it flies under the radar, but it shouldn't, because in any case you look at, you see the exact same dynamics. in Afghanistan, there's a chapter in the book that spends quite a lot of time, obviously, for obvious reasons, because this is a huge part of Canadian foreign policy in the 21st century. And for that section, I actually drew a lot of quotes from a book by widely noted conservative voice in Canada, close friend of Don Cherry. And I actually drew a huge amount of material from a book by Christy Blatchford, because she went to Afghanistan and spent time with the troops, of course, right? Support the troops. Which she did, of course, and she wrote this book about their heroism, their bravery, their stories, their struggles. And inadvertently, she gave me a huge amount of material to work with because these guys are super racist. There's just no way around it. They can't hide it. They're not capable. And Blatchford is so ignorant that she's unable to even recognize that that's what's happening in these quotes. I don't think Blatchford even realizes or recognizes how intensely racist and colonial it is when a Canadian soldier says, "Yeah, we get to Afghanistan and it's like walking through the pages of National Geographic. These people are 2,000 years behind." I mean, it's incredible, that statement. And by the way, that's par for the course. That's pretty standard kind of way in which the Canadians talk about being in Afghanistan and what it means there and the Afghans that they deal with. So it's fully there. The white supremacist logic, that is at the heart of the Canadian project, which is white people are better, white people are smarter, we've figured it all out, and, we'll help you other people to get there. I mean, that's basically what the Canadian narrative of Afghanistan is. Even the liberal version, even when you don't say atrocious things like these people are from National Geographic, the liberal narrative of we're going to Afghanistan to help this country to develop. We're going to help them to get modern institutions and modern technology and democracy and rule of law. All of this stuff is deeply colonial in the sense that it assumes that white nations have figured it out and are therefore entitled to invade other countries and tell them how to do things. This, of course, is so much more galling because it erases the actual history of Afghanistan, as that guy did when he said it's like they're 2,000 years behind. I mean, in fact, there's a very complicated history in Afghanistan, and in particular, modern history in Afghanistan when, in the 1970s, there is this, modernization project, and there's sections of the sort of, the liberal classes in Afghanistan, and then also the communist movement in Afghanistan, which are pushing for radical change in that country and succeeding. And that project is interrupted, as I know by the US-sponsored invasion of the Mujahideen. From that point on, Afghan history is extremely complicated. There's a lot of conflict, and, the American empire has got its hands all over this. And so when Canada goes to Afghanistan in 2001, yeah, I mean, circumstances aren't great for a lot of people there. But not because Afghans are idiots. Not because the country isn't capable of running its own affairs. Not because there are movements, mass movements in that country. Shola Javid, for instance, that have very well worked out plans for what, could be done differently in Afghanistan. But of course, Canada ignores that. And instead just says, no, these people are 2,000 years behind. We've got to teach them how to do things. That itself being a smokescreen for what Canada really wants to do, which is suck profit out of that country. SRK Consulting, Kilo Gold Mines, SNC-Lavalin, it's a laundry list of Canada's biggest corporations, that make a killing in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other parts of the Middle East where the war on terror is expanded. Canadian companies do really well. So, yeah, I mean, I think what you see when you look at these cases, whether it's, I've spoken about Afghanistan, but do the same thing for Haiti, we can do the same thing for Honduras, we can do the same thing for any number of different cases. We see the same dynamics. We see on the one hand, there is a fundamental material goal, which is ensure that capitalism is in charge. Ensure that any kind of left-wing challenge is eliminated and that capitalism and the rules and logic of capitalism are in place, and try to profit from that. Specifically, try to get your own capitalists in there to make money from that. And at the same time, do all of this on the premise that white people are providentially deigned to do this because they are superior, because they exist at the top of a racial hierarchy and therefore have the right, the responsibility to go into these other places and reshape them as they see fit, because they are white people, because they are, the advanced countries of the world. And so, yeah, I mean, it's the same logic. It's the same logic that you have in Canada's colonial conquest of Indigenous people operating right there in Afghanistan or in Iraq or Haiti or Honduras or anywhere else.
So there have been many other works that have been written about similar topics, about, Canada's foreign policy and imperialism and colonialism and the like. But what do you feel like might have been missing from those works about certain aspects of Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, there's definitely other scholarship out there and the stuff you mentioned, and also, I would add Jerome Clausen to that. He's written some really important stuff. Todd Gordon's written some really important stuff. So there definitely is some of this stuff out there. And a lot of it inspired me. A lot of it is, part of how I started thinking about these things. So I owe a huge debt of gratitude to those people, those researchers and activists and people who've done this work before me. But I guess what I think I brought to this study that is different from some of those other studies is, in the first place, making this very explicit connection between colonialism, settler colonialism, the conquest of Indigenous peoples, and everything else. I haven't seen a lot of work that has done that. Some have tried to bring it in and very usefully. Todd's work definitely addresses colonialism very effectively and does some really good things there. But what I tried to do was make it very explicit that this was a thread that ran through all the way, and that these threads, were very deeply sort of wound into the Canadian story and the Canadian psyche. And I think in doing that, what I offer in this book that is a little different from some of those other studies is that I explain it. I explain why. I've read Yves's work, for instance, is so good, and there's so much. He does so much. I mean, he must work, around the clock, because he's dug up so much really, really important stuff, much of which I've used. I mined his work. That's I don't want to use that term, but I in this context especially, but I drew from his work extensively. But, I think what I am able to do in this book that doesn't always come through in some other work is to say there's more to this than just Canadians going out there and being assholes, which is true. I'm not going to argue against that, but I want to know, and I'm interested to know why. Why are Canadians going out there and acting like assholes? What is driving this? Because I don't believe that it's impossible that people born in this place could have better politics and could do better things. I'm not going to essentialize, about Canadians. That doesn't even make sense, given that Canadians are so different, given that people are placed so differently within Canada, different classes of people, certainly obviously along racial divides, gender divides, all kinds of other divides. People are different in Canada. So I'm not going to essentialize and just assume that, Canadians are a bunch of assholes. What I want to do, and what I try to do in this book, is figure out what are the broader dynamics that shape the creation of Canada and then shape what Canada becomes. And when I talk about Canada, I'm always very explicit that I'm talking about the state, the Canadian state, and the interests that it represents, and the people whose interests are wound up in the Canadian state. And I do that, and I keep an eye on those people who are within Canada, the targets of the Canadian state, right? I mean, Canada continues to be a racist country internally. That's, I know you don't, we all on the left understand this, but I mean, there are Canadians who still buy into this bizarre liberal myth that somehow Canada is a multicultural country and there's no racism. I mean, this is nonsense. Canada remains a racist country even internally. And that's, of course, then reflected in Canada's behavior externally. So, there's a lot of ways in which the story of Canadian colonialism and imperialism are complicated and really require a kind of a deeper understanding of how capitalism and culture in capitalism and ideology in capitalism operate. For instance, when Canada is involved in a horrific episode in Somalia in 1993 that involves the murder of Somali children and, of course, the torture and killing of Shidane Aron, a Somali teenager, the story is complicated by the fact that two of the people involved centrally in the torture are Indigenous. They're Canadian soldiers, but they are Indigenous. And so, we really need, when we're parsing out the Canadian story, we really need to have the capacity to assess these things in complicated ways, to understand class and race and nation and gender and in complicated ways. And what my book tries to do is to work through this material in a way that can handle and can sustain these complicated parts, where the narrative can make sense, where the story of what Canada is and what Canada does, I hope that for someone reading this book, they will come away with a sense of not just what has happened, but why. How is it possible that, Canadian soldiers, including Indigenous soldiers, could go to Somalia and commit acts of white supremacist murder and violence? How is that possible? Well, this book tries to explain how that's possible. That's what I think, that's what I hope I've done. I mean, you tell me after you've read it, but I hope that's what it's done, is to provide a kind of an explanation for how all this has happened and why.
Yeah, I know that you've outlined that you were attempting to write from a more Marxist perspective, and I think that explains, the depth of what you are attempting to do, which is to outline that this is a question of the fundamental mode of production, which is capitalism of Canada, and, the settler aspect to that as well. And I think digging deeper is what allows your work to kind of benefit a more revolutionary outlook, to understand that, this is not a question of just bad people in certain political positions that are making bad policy, but that it's something much deeper than that. And it's actually the fundamental way in which the society functions economically and therefore socially as well.
Exactly. I mean, it would be so easy, and God, I wish it were, as easy as we got some bad people in government and we got to get them out. So, let's all get out the vote. And, let's get better people in there so they can make better policies, and then we can turn this ship around. I mean, that'd be amazing. God damn it. That would be so easy. And I would love it if that were the way we could solve these problems. But there's no part of me for even a second that believes that that's the genesis of Canadian policy. I agree with what you said entirely. I think that the point here, and what I hope this study helps to illustrate, is that the problem is so much deeper than individual people and individual policies. And that's why there's continuity. That's how it's possible that there could be such continuity between what is emanating from, what becomes the Canadian state in 1867, is the same thing emanating in 2020. That's only possible because it's not about individuals. It's about structures. It's about ideologies. It's about the mode of production. It's about the desperate need of the capitalist class to protect itself and to protect its source of wealth and its source of power and privilege. And when that capitalist class is refracted through the experience of Canada, that involves colonialism, that involves racism, that involves all kinds of strategies to maintain itself, to maintain its position. And so, yeah, to me, there's really no way to meaningfully explain or understand how Canada behaves except through a kind of a Marxist approach, where you try to understand, what are the deep-rooted structures here? What are the classes that are in conflict? What interests do those classes have? And how do they try to achieve them? And the ruling class, the capitalist class in Canada, has done a very good job of achieving its goals. It's done a really good job of it, and it's bought off or co-opted or, convinced huge sections of what could be part of the Canadian working class, to essentially side with the Canadian project. That's how nationalism works. That's why nationalism exists. effectively is to try to, bring working class people over to the side of the ruling class. And it's worked very well in Canada. But, at the same time, I think there are signs that it can't hold. It's not holding in the United States right now. We're watching it fall apart in 2020 in the United States. And I think as we slide into a greater, deeper depression, one that's been coming for a long time, but now has been set off by the pandemic, I think we will see a deeper radicalization of the working classes in the United States and in Canada. And I think that will open up a lot more space for revolutionary organizations to do the work of kind of building that consciousness and having it grow beyond just a kind of an immediate anger and into a deeper kind of revolutionary project. And I think we can expect a much more intense round of class struggle in the next 10 to 20 years, which of course also means that the reaction will be every bit as swift and as intense, right? Will you and I be able to have this conversation publicly and do a podcast and all of this in 2040? I don't know, because we're certainly going to see the fascist reaction, right? And it's interesting, maybe this comes around full circle to some of your questions about, class composition in Canada and so on. I mean, there's sections of the Canadian working class that will radicalize and turn to the left, and there's sections of the Canadian working class that will radicalize to the right. And I guess, at some level, the goal of everyone on the left, everyone who, believes in a better world, is going to be to try as much as we can to create the conditions where, as things get worse over these next 10 years, people are going to be drawn to the left and not the right.
How would you say your understanding of Canadian settler capitalism has evolved from your first book, Ottawa and Empire, and this new one?
I think for me, probably the biggest shift, or I guess, let me answer it this way. The thing I learned most when I was working on this book specifically, a lot of what I've written in this book is, the product of just so many years, of just kind of accumulating knowledge and so on. But there were sections for this book where I really had to go in and find out, okay, well, what actually happened? What was Canada's response to Indian independence or whatever. And I think I was shocked by how explicit Canadian white supremacy has been, up until very, very recently. Which is not to say that it's gone, but that it's less explicit now. But up until very, very recently, you have newspapers in Canada, portraying South Asians in diapers because they're so backwards. You have, the N-word being used in Canadian newspapers in the 1960s as people wrote in letters to the editor about, the cannibals in the Congo and used the N-word to describe them. Canadian officials describing the riffraff of the Latin American left, and by this they mean the people being murdered by Augusto Pinochet in 1973. So I guess the explicitness of Canadian white supremacy, which growing up in Canada, and growing up in the 90s in Canada, I obviously at some level still clung to what little bit of belief I had in the idea that Canadians at least tried to hide their racism. And what I discovered is that really there hasn't been much effort to hide it. It's a pretty weak effort. It's weak as piss. So, I guess maybe that's a piece that has shifted for me. But otherwise, what I found in doing this book was, I guess I was surprised by the extent to which my thesis held up. When I started the project, I was pretty convinced that I was going to find that yes, everywhere I look in Canadian foreign policy, you find the ghosts of colonialism. But I fully expected to find counter cases. I fully expected to find examples that didn't fit, examples where, they kind of ran contrary to, and I didn't. I really didn't. I found cases where activist networks, social movements, revolutionary groups in Canada forced the Canadian state to concede a little bit, right? So, in the 1980s, when Canada is supporting the US Contra wars, just absolutely tearing apart Central America and Nicaragua in particular to try to destroy the left and make Central America capitalist again, there are moments where the Canadian state wavers in its support. And there are cracks in the edifice. For instance, the Canadian state allowing refugees to seek asylum in Canada, refugees from Nicaragua, from a war it was supporting. And that seems like a contradiction, but of course the reason for it is that there were very well organized and mobilized activist networks in Canada demanding it. And so, it's a good reminder that, and I try to keep this thread running too in the book, that there is a Canadian state, and it's going to do what it wants to do, and it represents, obviously, the interests of the Canadian capitalist class in this country. That's clear. But in order to function, the Canadian state has usually had to roll with, to a certain extent, where the public was at. And when the working class has been able to mobilize, especially when it's been able to, get beyond its racism and mobilize more broadly, the Canadian state has at times been forced to kind of make concessions. So I saw that, and I was glad to see that. But I did not find cases where, of its own volition, from itself, the Canadian state veered from the path of settler capitalism and the colonial imagination. What I found is that it consistently trod that path all the way through and continues to this day.
What would you say are some books or works that might help people get a deeper understanding of what we're discussing?
I think getting a really robust understanding of the conquest and the genocide is really important. I think that's probably, I think it's happening more in the Canadian left now. That there's much more willingness to do that, but I think that is still lacking. And I think really, really grappling with what the conquest meant, what the genocide meant, getting past the idea that this was a bad thing that happened, many years ago, and understanding that this is an ongoing process, that this is a continued process. And so, in that regard, I drew a lot from Howard Adams, who was a Métis scholar and an activist, and I think to a certain extent was really informed by the Marxist tradition as well. And his work is phenomenal and in many ways very foundational for me. So definitely Howard Adams and other scholars like him and scholars who draw from him, people like Glenn Sean Coulthard and others who are, really kind of trying to theorize what it means to build Indigenous revolution in Canada. So that for sure. I think it's also important to try to take up some of the work by scholars like Shireen Razik, who also try to trace the kind of racial capitalist line in Canada. So, that was, her work was another that really influenced me. In particular, she has a book on Somalia where she talks about, obviously, the torture scandal in Somalia, but what she does so effectively is show how white supremacy operates in that case. And she's an article about Afghanistan where she does the same thing. And her work is just really, really good at showing the link between racism and capitalism and the pursuit of capitalist goals, which we can lose. We can get very focused on one or the other, right? We can get very focused on white supremacy and racism and lose sight of what's kind of underneath it, mobilizing it. What's giving it power? Obviously, what gives racism power is when you have, wealth and resources to act on it, and that's part of the story of white supremacy is white people not just being racist but also having the resources to act on their racism. So her work is really valuable for that, I think, in making those connections. I mean, there's a lot, right? But I think trying to understand trying to get beyond maybe the older kind of versions of proletariat and bourgeoisie, the kind of the static categories, which I know obviously there's lots of movements in Canada now that are, obviously getting beyond that, but there are still, you still find some of those kind of mechanistic portrayals of those categories, and getting beyond that to understand, what does a proletariat look like now? What is the proletariat in Canada in 2020? Who is in the working class? Where do they work? Who doesn't work? And how are people who are not working still part of the working class? All of this stuff, the racism of the working class, the racial hierarchies in the working class, but also the anti-racism of the working class. Where is that? We often don't see the anti-racism of the working class because the trade unions, the big trade unions, stifle the voice of many working class people. And so we hear from the fairly white supremacist trade union leaders. We don't necessarily always hear from anti-racist workers, right? So I don't know. I guess some of that stuff is part of what influenced this work, trying to get a better sense of that.
So what advice or insight would you like to give to revolutionaries or Maoists such as myself in regards to understanding Canadian settler capitalism? Doesn't necessarily have to be advice, but, just any insight or thoughts that you might have.
Yeah, because far be it for me to give any advice, right? That's it's the worst kind of academic, sits on the sidelines giving advice to revolutionaries, right? So I'm not going to do that. I'll take the advice of revolutionaries, and hopefully join them. But, what I said at the end of this book, what I wrote at the end of it is I actually, in the book, I pleaded the fifth in terms of waving a particular flag within the Marxist tradition. But what I said was that any revolutionary project in Canada, in my view, has to understand that, in my view at least, that there is nothing redeemable about the thing called Canada. That there is no revolutionary project that can reclaim Canada, that can take Canada and turn Canada into a better Canada. To me, that's just logically impossible, because Canada is of its very nature a colonial imposition. So, a better Turtle Island, sure. A different place, a different kind of political conception, a different kind of state. Yeah, sure. One that is driven by the project of decolonization, because decolonization has not happened. I know you know this, but it's often forgotten by Canadians. Canadians imagine, many Canadians believe that Confederation was decolonization. That we were somehow colonized by Britain and we got our freedom. And actually, you see that in the book. I use quotes by Canadian officials all along, all throughout the history, saying, well, Canada's path to independence, Canada's, decolonial path. It's like, no. You weren't colonized, bro. Lester B. Pearson was not colonized. He was the colonizer. Canada was the colonizing force, and it is still in power. So to imagine that Canada could be redeemed doesn't make sense to me. Canada has to be overthrown. Canada has to be decolonized. Whatever comes next, whatever decolonizes Canada, that can be redeemed. People who live here can be part of that struggle. It's not to suggest that if you're born in this place, you're somehow inherently evil and irredeemable. That's not what I'm suggesting for a second. But the state, the thing that we call Canada, and the symbols associated with it, and the ideology associated with it, and the material interests associated with it, that's all got to go. I don't see any way that, that justice as conceived by the left could ever be achieved. True equality, true social, harmonious social relations between people, an actual relationship with nature that is not, violent and destructive and self-destructive. Any of the goals of people on the left that we deem to be important cannot be solved by Canada or through Canada. So that, I guess, is the only, I wouldn't call it advice, but the only contribution I would say I would make to thinking about what revolutionary struggles have to look like is that they can't look like Canada, and they can't look Canadian, and they can't really be associated with Canada. They have to be thinking beyond Canada, thinking about a decolonized Canada and what would we build in place of Canada, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think even for myself, one of the main reasons and things that drew me to the PCR-RCP and being a supporter of the PCR-RCP was the fact that their line on settler capitalism and settler colonialism is not one that attempts to reclaim the Canadian identity or attempts to pretend as if we can create a better Canada as Canada. I find that especially the electoral parties, even the most quote unquote progressive of them, tends to do this. And I feel like that's a clear sign of kind of settler chauvinism and thinking that you can reclaim a thing that was fundamentally kind of rotten from the start.
Totally. And you know, the idea, and you hear this often, and you do hear this from people on the left, certainly in that kind of NDP, realm, this idea that like, what we need is like the true Canadian values, and Justin Trudeau or Stephen Harper, they haven't been living up to true Canadian values, but true Canadian values are multiculturalism, anti-racism, equality, justice, right? And you'll hear that mobilized, sometimes maybe just strategically because it resonates with people. Sometimes I think sincerely they believe that, and that is just, I mean, it's so wrong. Like it's like wrong in the sense of just being incorrect. It's that those have never ever been Canadian values. At no point has Canada ever stood for those things. And to the extent that its actions have at times seemed like maybe it stood for those things, it was usually bullshit. I mean, it was usually some kind of a smokescreen, and that's so much of what my book tries to do is to validate that claim. I say that here to you on this podcast, but in the book, I try to actually go in and look at all of these specific cases. The book is exhaustive. It's all over the place, looking at the specifics of each different case to say, no, Canada did not help Indonesia. Canada facilitated a massacre there. That's what Canada did. No, Canada did not help Brazil in the 1960s. Canada supported a dictatorship that overthrew the government there. That's what Canada did. At no point has Canada ever actually exhibited or inhabited the values that I think sort of left liberals ascribe to Canada. And so it's just wrong. It's just incorrect. And to repeat that is to actually repeat the propaganda of the ruling class. So I think we need to get beyond that, and we need to give up on that. Believe in justice, believe in equality, fight for those things, yeah, but not because they're Canadian values. They've never been Canadian values. There are values, and I stand behind them, but Justin's not with us.
So that was my interview with Tyler A. Shipley, whose newest book is entitled Canada in the World: Settler Capitalism and Colonial Imagination. This is a book that you can buy from Fernwood Publishing. And for that, you can go to fernwoodpublishing.ca or just Google Canada in the World, Tyler Shipley, and you'll be able to find his book. You could also find him on Twitter at Canada in the World, world spelled WRLD. So thank you so much. Go to enmasspodcast.com or patreon.com/enmasspodcast to support, and that is all.